both World Championships are closer than they've been for a number of years, with the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships looking like they could go down to the final race in Abu Dhabi. A key factor in both of these championships, though, has been the contribution of the second drivers at each of the teams in contention. Valtteri Bottas and Sergio Pérez have both had difficult seasons, but are improving through the second half of this year. So has the title come down to which of these two drivers could perform the best? Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. The focus in the latter stages of this season has been on Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, and rightly so. These two drivers have been driving incredibly well all season, and the pair of them are simply in a different league in 2021. But with the two fastest cars so closely matched, it's important for both of these to have a strong teammate in order to support them with strategy differentials and simply being there to put pressure on their title rival. This video will look at how both Bottas and Perez have improved through the latter stages of this season, and evaluate which of these has done the better job so far this season. Valtteri Bottas' season so far. First up, we're going to look at Bottas' season, and I think it's fair to say that the first half of the season for Bottas was poor. Some highlights included a pole position in Portugal, a good display in Monaco before losing out in a fault that was out of his control, and a second place finish at the Austrian Grand Prix. It's worth noting here that Bottas did take a podium finish at 6 of the 11 races in the first half, but alongside that there were also some dreadful performances. Take the poor display in Imola before his retirement, his inability to progress through the field in Azerbaijan, and the quite frankly amateurish crash in Hungary. But with a summer to regroup, reset, and a long-term deal signed with Alfa Romeo, Bottas seems to have come back stronger. In Italy, Bottas won the sprint qualifying event, having been the fastest in Friday qualifying. And then, having dropped back to the back of the order with an engine penalty, he recovered through the field incredibly well to take third in that Grand Prix. Now it's worth noting that Bottas did of course benefit from the two title contenders clashing, but regardless, a last on the grid to third at the finish is a result that has to be one of the strongest drives of the season, and he's proved that he could overtake other cars at Monza, something that the Finnish driver did definitely struggle with in 2020. You then have Bottas' performance in Russia, where once again he had to recover from the back of the order following another grid drop. On this occasion, he struggled to make his way through the field, but once rain fell, he took a gamble to switch onto the wet tyres early, and he ended up coming back to finish 5th at the end of that Grand Prix. So yes, a bit of luck was had, but a solid result and another engine to add to his pool. Turkey represented probably Bottas' best race in 2021, where he took pole position, the fastest lap, and the win in what looked like a comfortable drive at the front. The Mercedes car was particularly dominant that weekend, but Bottas was comfortable throughout that race. Now of course, Lewis Hamilton did set the fastest time in qualifying, but the history books will say that Bottas took pole position there, and again, this represented a race where Bottas did absolutely dreadfully in 2020, but picked up his performance and delivered a great result in 2021, holding Verstappen at arm's length throughout the 58-lap race. And then more recently in Mexico, Bottas was on top form, taking pole position despite the track traditionally not being a strong one for the Mercedes team, and he could have done well if it wasn't for the Finnish driver being spun out at turn 1 by Daniel Ricciardo, to then be frustrated throughout the rest of the race being unable to overtake the McLaren driver. He did also get criticism from his team regarding the fact that he opened the door to allow Verstappen to get past at the beginning of the race, but I don't really agree with those comments given that it was a wide part of the track and a very long straight down into turn 1. Either way, the fact that he got the pole showed he was starting to find some form again. So how has Bottas found this form? Well, I believe it's something to do with having a positive mentality. Ever since Valtteri Bottas has been confirmed to be driving for Alfa Romeo next year and beyond, there has been an uptick in his form, and this has come despite the fact that he's taken 3 separate engine penalties in the second half of this season. In a recent interview with Tom Clarkson on the Beyond the Grid podcast, Bottas says exactly this, and the fact that having a multi-year deal has helped him as he's able to worry less about his long-term future. It's clear that he's recovered well from the lows of the first half of this season, and knowing that he's in the last few races of his Mercedes career, he's certainly trying to prove to everyone that he deserved to hold that seat for 5 years. My frustration with Bottas though is the fact that he's always failed to keep these performances up for a full season. He's often started his seasons well with Mercedes and then had a rough patch, and I'm not saying that it's easy for him to keep up that strong form for a full 20 plus race season, but I suppose it's the difference between the very good drivers and the elite drivers that he's being compared to. But before I get into evaluating Sergio Perez's season, I want to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to Behind the Drive. We're well on the way to our 25,000 subscriber target by the end of the season, and if you haven't hit the button already, then please consider subscribing. Thanks. Sergio Perez's season so far. And then we move on to Sergio Perez, a driver who came into this season with a lot of pressure on his shoulders after he was the third driver that Red Bull had brought in an attempt to replace Daniel Ricciardo, who left that team in 2018. Perez was the first driver that was brought into that team from outside of their driver development program since Mark Webber in 2007. So to bring in a driver from outside of their own ranks was a significant move for the Red Bull team. And as such, the performances from that second Red Bull car were also expected to improve, given both Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon had struggled in the second driver position at that team. The theory had been that the Red Bull car is dialed in for Max Verstappen's driving style, and that the team aren't keen to take it in any other direction given how strong the car can be in the hands of the Dutchman. So Perez has been expected to pick things up quickly in 2021, and given his experience driving for multiple different teams and cars in Formula 1, it was hoped that he would be able to adjust his driving style to match that of Max Verstappen. And early on in the year, he did indeed struggle, with only 2 podium finishes in the first half of the season, something that when you compare to Bottas' 6 is fairly poor. But some highlights from that first half of the year did include the Imola qualifying, where Perez put his Red Bull in P2, out-qualifying Verstappen, before a disappointing race. And then of course you can't ignore that race in Azerbaijan, where Perez picked up the pieces in that race after Verstappen's tyre blowout and Hamilton's mistake. Perez also performed well in France, with a strong run to P3, and his ability to nurse the tyres was critical in Red Bull's split strategy approach. So there were certainly moments of brilliance in that first half of the season, something that showed he could make the car work for him at some circuits. But the second half of the season has been much stronger for Perez so far, where he seems to have been improving and getting more comfortable in that car in the latter stages of this season. Some particular highlights include Turkey, where he did well in the tricky conditions to hold Hamilton behind him, preventing the British driver from progressing further up the order and catching up to Verstappen ahead. In that race he ended up finishing third, in a strong performance considering he was driving the second fastest car that weekend. The USA was also a strong performance for Perez, where he proved pivotal in a strategic race that unfolded. It was Perez running in third that meant that Red Bull were able to pit both cars and pressure Hamilton into pitting as well. With Bottas out of the picture in that race, it was 2 versus 1, something that's so valuable when competing at the front. And again, the Mexican driver came third at that Grand Prix, and yes, he was away off the front too, but following the race it emerged that he didn't even have a water bottle for the vast majority of the laps. And given that race was one of the warmest of the season, it was all the more impressive that Perez managed to get that final spot on the podium, ensuring he kept Charles Leclerc a few seconds behind him. And then, the most recent race at the time of recording, Sergio Perez was racing at his home Grand Prix in Mexico. And once again, he was on the pace throughout the weekend, despite having a second choice rear wing for qualifying in the race. He qualified 4th, but gained an advantage following Bottas' spin at the first turn, and then did incredibly well racing against Hamilton, ensuring that the British driver was far more concerned about Perez behind him than he was Verstappen ahead of him. Perez could have overtaken Hamilton if he'd have had a few more laps, but regardless, he'd done everything that he'd needed to in Mexico for Red Bull. And in Brazil's Friday qualifying session, Perez was once again just off the pace of Verstappen, being just over 1/10 of a second behind Verstappen's Q3 time and just over 1/100th of a second behind Bottas. Given the limited practice running before that session with the sprint qualifying to come, it was a good result for Perez, as he was quickly able to get on the pace from the first running of the weekend. It shows that this isn't just some tracks being more attuned to Perez's driving style, it's a significant step forward in his ability to drive that tricky car like Max Verstappen can. And these performances have supported the team and his teammate in taking that crucial step forward, which has put them in a dominant position going into the Brazilian Grand Prix weekend. It also shows that Red Bull absolutely made the right call when bringing him into the team. Which of these drivers has done the better job? So we now have the tricky question of which of these two drivers has done the better job of supporting their teammate. And on paper you have to say that Bottas has had the better season given he has more points and more podium finishes. But timing is also critical in this championship, and being in the position to sometimes sacrifice your own Grand Prix to help your teammate is something that wouldn't be seen in the Drivers' Championship standings. And from a timing perspective, while both of these drivers have taken a step forward in the last few races, it's Sergio Perez that's really delivered. Yes, you could easily argue that Bottas has been hampered with various engine penalties and being spun out in Mexico, but Pérez has upped his qualifying form and found a way to be in the right place from the start of the races and influencing those tactical decisions on track. And with this being the case, he's done enough to help Verstappen. And it's these situations where he gets himself in the mix with Verstappen and Hamilton that we haven't really seen Bottas do as many times this year, in my opinion. And whenever it's been 2 versus 2 at the front, it's been Pérez that's been there offering that all-important support for Verstappen. I do believe that Bottas and Pérez could both have performed much better in 2021. They've had tricky races and their form has been far from consistent. But it must be said that their respective teammates are 2 of the greatest drivers in Formula 1 history, and both of those drivers have proven their consistency across a full season. It's just been incredible to see. For me though, it's Pérez that has done his job the best to this point in the year, and he's simply done well enough to get up to speed in that car and be the best option for Red Bull on the whole. And these performances at the right time could well be the critical element which wins the title for Verstappen and Red Bull in 2021. So that's my thoughts on the number 2 drivers and the 2 teams in contention for the championships this year. Let me know your thoughts on these 2, and if you watched this video this far, then make sure to leave it a like, and thanks for watching.